Today's presentation will be given by Marty Powers and Sally Michelson Davidson, Professor of Chinese Arts and Cultures at the University of Michigan and former Director of the Center for Chinese Studies. In 1993, his book, Art and Political Expression in Early China, Yale University Press, received the Lieberthal Prize for the best book in pre-20th century Chinese studies. His research focuses on the role of the arts in the history of human relations in China, with an emphasis on issues of personal agency and social justice. His Pattern and Person, Ornaments, Society and Self in Classic China was published by Harvard University Press East Asian Series in 2006 and has been awarded the Lieberthal Prize for 2008, the second time. And he has served on numerous national committees, including NEH, ACLS, and the advisory board of the Center for Advanced Studies in the Visual Arts. He has taught in the history departments at Tsinghua, Peking University, Zhejiang University, and has published articles and essays in multiple venues in Chinese, including an editorial series in the Journal of Culture and Current Affairs, 读书. In 2009, he was resident at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Princeton, writing a book on the role of China in the cultural politics of the English Enlightenment. In the spring of 2012, he delivered the Wang Guowei Memorial Lecture at Tsinghua. Together with Dr. Catherine, this is Jiang, he is co-editing the Blackwell Companion to Chinese Art. Today he will be speaking on the politics of brushstroke. Please join me to welcome Marty.
Thank you, San. Go ahead.
Marty has to teach at 1 o'clock, so the talk will end right at 1 or a couple of minutes ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll try to leave some time for questions. It's always a pleasure to speak to this distinguished crowd. Okay, I'm going to just jump into it. In Identity and Violence, Amartya Sen observed that a major source of potential conflict in the contemporary world is the presumption that people can be uniquely categorized on the basis of religion or culture. The book, in fact, documents some of the unspeakable horrors that otherwise good people visit upon others because they've learned to view them as rivals, alien beings possessing no values in common with themselves. In a sustained attack on the Huntington hypothesis, Sen argues that fundamental differences in cultural values are illusory, because no one is ever simply a Christian or an Englishman, but adopts multiple roles and identities, such as father or neighbor. What makes Sen's book relevant for historians of art is the fact that Huntingtonian views have been common in our discipline since its inception in the 18th century. Ever since Winckelmann, art has been treated as a clue to the fundamental values of different and competing civilizations, Greek Western versus Egyptian Oriental in Winckelmann's case. As a consequence, art played a major role in the national myths developed from the 18th century through the 20th centuries. There's nothing new in noting the complicity of history of art in the formation of nationalist narratives, but what is less often observed is the paradox inherent in that relationship. National myths, after all, stress purity of culture and stability of values. Westerners love freedom, while Orientals are slavish, to take Winckelmann's example. Yet the cultural politics necessitated by such myth-making is anything but pure. Cultural politics is by nature dialectical. It arises when an intellectual from one tradition interprets or reinterprets another tradition. It's often defensive, devised in response to a challenge from some other. It is often strategic and opportunistic rather than the product of deeply held beliefs. Intellectuals, excuse me, I got a bit of a cold. Constructing a national myth may resort to equivocation, substitution, misprision, or displacement in defense of their imagined nation's honor. Consider Louis Lecomte's response to the magnificence of Chinese imperial architecture. I confess that medley of beams, joists, rafters, and pinions bears a surprising singularity, because we must needs judge that such a walk was not done without great expense. But to speak the truth, it proceeds only from the ignorance of their workmen, who never could find out that noble simplicity, which becomes at once the solidity and beauty of our buildings. Now, much of what Lecomte wrote about China adopted an us-them framework and sought to bolster European pride in the face of another advanced civilization. At the time, for instance, the larger cities in China were larger than those in Europe, a fact Lecomte found intimidating. But then, he says, one comfort, my lord, is that these proud cities, which styled themselves ladies of the universe, have been forced to open their gates to the gospel, and are partly subdued by our religion. From a 21st century perspective, this sounds more like sour grapes than ethnographic description. Likewise, in the passage on architecture, Lecomte was impressed with the complexity and magnificence of imperial buildings, so in defense of European honor, he argued that, unlike European buildings, Manchu architecture was wanting in its lack of simplicity. Unfortunately for Lecomte's argument, the reigning architectural style in France at the time he wrote was the Baroque. Lecomte's vision of European architecture was shaped by his encounter with Chinese buildings, but it wasn't a process you could call influence. Rather, the challenge China posed to his own national myth forced Lecomte to redefine in binary terms a practice that the French and Qing courts in fact shared in common: architectural elaboration as a sign of magnificence. What this little encounter reveals is not a Huntingtonian clash of stable values, but instead a strategic substitution in response to cultural competition. Lecomte described different values to China and France opportunistically, even to the point of contradicting contemporaneous practice in France. Such opportunism is a characteristic feature of cultural politics, but it would be a mistake to dismiss this as petty or self-serving. This essay argues that cultural politics has been an important driving force in the evolution of style, particularly in the modern era. Now, if we view styles as shaped by competition between nations, then some viewing practices must have been shared, at least in part, with one or more others. Considered this way, styles may be better understood as encoding scales of value, values that can be negotiated with others. It's evident, for instance, that Lecomte knew how to assess the magnificence of Qing architecture. Now, likewise, for example, in this case, you could see that all of these artists were working under a different set of scales of value, but it's conceivable, at least, that Clara Peters and Liu Cai might have shared some common skills, viewing skills, and expectations. Both artists would be looking for physiognomic accuracy in the rendering of the fish, scales, fins or eyes, and a believable disposition of light and shade. In this respect, Winkelmann was correct. Style or taste can encode social values. What does not follow is the notion that different values correspond to stable and distinct cultural regions. Now, this example illustrates an important fact about styles and values, namely that every scale of value has two ends. If detailed elaboration sits at one end, then plainness sits at the other. If naturalism and finish sit at one end, then flatness and sloppiness sit at the other. It is never the case that one end of the scale is without value. On the contrary, both ends of the scale represent values, and each derives meaning from the others. In other words, visual values are correlative. As one increases, the other diminishes. And that means that values at one end are available for appropriation by groups wishing to distinguish themselves from those advocating values at the other end. When this happens, a clash of values is likely to occur, though it often happens within the same culture. Now, in our art history surveys, the classic instance of such a clash is the rejection of naturalism in favor of self-expression at the end of the 19th century. Richard Schiff has warned against reductive accounts of the transformation from transparent or naturalistic to opaque or surface materiality style, but nonetheless he observes that, here I quote, "For the modernist, self-expression becomes most evident when the normative look of represented objects is transformed by the material substance of paint applied to a surface," unquote. Granting that, I quote again, every picture may seem to possess both transparent and opaque features, unquote, it isn't difficult to understand why a tension developed between transparency and opacity. Artistic assertion, after all, demands the artist's personal intervention into pictorial space, but such interventions tend to expose the fiction in fictive space, as in the Cézanne. Now, one might object that naturalistic works also can adopt a brushy mode, but it would be anachronistic to interpret such brushwork as self-expressive, or even as an early type of brushiness that would lead to self-expression. Rather, in the case of Xiaokui, for example, as with a Van Dyck, for example, the image remains naturalistic when viewed from a distance. The brushy technique serves as a display of artistic assurance, manner, or virtuosity, qualities likely to impress a courtly patron. This, of course, is just the opposite of that bald rejection of aristocratic taste encoded in a Cézanne or in a literati painting. Now, in the traditional narrative, Cézanne's self-assertion is interpreted in nationalist terms. But I would like to make of this correlative pair a test case to illustrate the instability of cultural values across temporal and national boundaries. We'll see that far from revealing the essence of anyone's Volksgeist, the expressive mark is a rhetorically powerful device that can be deployed or demonized by intellectuals working in several parts of the globe. Let's begin by looking at an earlier moment when naturalism and self-expression occupied opposite poles on a shared scale of value. As students of Chinese painting surveys know, Chinese artists developed techniques for rendering light and shadow, texture, three-dimensional form, and deep space over a period of several centuries. Critics of the time marveled how artists could make you feel as if you were actually there, and boasted that modern artists far surpassed the classical masters in this respect. Those same students of Chinese surveys also know that by the late 11th century, these pictorial achievements were being ridiculed as little more than craftsmen's tricks, a sentiment often encapsulated in Saussures' famous lines, which were being quoted already in the 13th century. If anyone discusses painting in terms of resemblance, his understanding is nearly that of a child. Now, while few examples of Sung literati painting survive, what does survive is sufficient to provide some sense of what theory meant in practical terms. In Chao Zhongchang's early 12th century scroll, we find a total absence of deep space, such as was normative or common in the 11th century. Rather, the space is flattened. In fact, you've got several lines of perspective. Here you're looking almost down into the pool. Here you're looking straight from the side. Here you've got sort of a three-quarter view. And this is the top. This isn't, and this is the bottom. This is not a detail. Clearly, the artists were breaking some of the rules that were normative at that time, and they say as much. Now, as with Cézanne, this could be interpreted in nationalist terms, but it's well to bear in mind that Sung literati painters developed their styles in competition with the court. Since the court valued naturalism and finish, the literati had little choice but to adopt coarser brushwork that, as a byproduct, left clear traces of the artist's choices. Every single stroke here is visible, whereas that's not the case there. Flattening space suddenly and radically, likewise, was an unmistakable sign of the artist's personal intervention, in flagrant contradiction to scales of value chosen by a cultural rival. In essence, the literati rejected courtly values by turning a shared scale of value on its head. Now naturalism sat at the negative end, while coarseness and facture marked the positive end of the scale. Now, by the late 13th century, literati scales of value had become dominant, and by the 15th century, naturalism was no longer much of an issue. Artists rarely referred to it polemically, but the arrival of Europeans changed all that. Now, suddenly, the very existence of European painting constituted a challenge to literati scales of value and vice versa. Matteo Ricci offered an assessment of Chinese painting that would be echoed by most European observers right through the 19th century, and this is often quoted. The Chinese use pictures extensively, but in the production of these, they have not at all acquired the skill of Europeans. They know nothing of the art of painting in oil or the use of perspective in their pictures, with the result that their productions are likely to resemble the dead rather than the living. Now, it isn't difficult to divine what sits at the top of Ricci's scale of value. Illusionistic skill, following the rules of perspective or foreshortening, and the requisite finish. Having said that, one should not overlook hints of anxiety. First, the passage takes shape as an us-them contrast. Ricci recognizes that people in China use pictures extensively, as in Europe. China, in other words, rivals Europe in that respect. However, despite having produced pictures for centuries, they still have not managed to learn how to paint in oil or to apply the rules of perspective. This is a snub, pure and simple, and one that reveals the agonistic stance adopted by many European travelers to China. But this is not to imply that Chinese critics were indifferent to the European challenge or that they experienced less anxiety than their European counterparts. Consider Wu Li's defense of Chinese scales of value in the 17th century. Our painting values originality, not resemblance. We call this inspired and free. Their painting is all about shading, volume, and resemblance, and is achieved by laboriously following convention. It's the same with signatures. We sign at the top of the painting, while they sign at the bottom. The use of the brush is also different in all respects. It's always this way. I've never been able to explain it. Now, originality here is expressed in the phrase to abandon the beaten track and establish a style of one's own. Yi, one of many Chinese terms for freedom, implies release from a state of bondage, in this case bondage to conventional rules. Like the Ricci statement, this passage is structured on an us-them binary contrast, and so Wu begins by taking the other as a potential rival whose very existence suggests an alternative economy of picture-making. But where Ricci had no experience of an anti-naturalistic and expressive theory of arts, Wu Li did have categories for describing illusionistic painting. Categories such as laborious or conventional hark back to Sung literati critique of naturalism. And just as Ricci complained of a lack of skill so as to denigrate Chinese painting, Wu Li cites that very reliance on skill to disparage Western painting. The two men shared a common correlative scale of value, but they defended opposite ends of that scale. Now, intense competition between different artists and their supporting critics all but demanded the invention of terms for original, inspired, or free, as this is the vocabulary of artistic distinction. Similar terms would arise in Europe as artists began to assert their personal agency following the demise of aristocratic privilege in the 18th century. But in Ricci's day, none of this could have been foreseen. So we should be careful not to fall victim to Wu Li's rhetoric, however familiar it may sound. As we shall see, Wu Li's rhetorical position was no more stable in China than was the attachment to naturalism in Europe. Before long, Chinese and Europeans would exchange positions on the naturalism versus expression debate. Now, during the 18th century, European artists continued to criticize Chinese painting for its lack of naturalism, while Chinese artists continued to defend the expressionist credo. In his Little Mountain Painting Manual, Zhou Yigui developed a new defense for expressionism, but at the same time revealed a deeper understanding of the achievements of European painting. Westerners are good at geometry. Therefore, when it comes to shading and spatial depth, their painting is exact in every detail. In their paintings of figures of architecture, everything has shading, and their use of color or brushwork is completely different from Chinese practice. In composing shadows, they calculate the way they diminish according to the rules of geometry. In paintings of palaces or walls, you feel as if you're about to walk into them. Students can learn a few tricks from them by way of catching people's attention, but they have no brushwork to speak of, and their skill is that of the craftsman. Consequently, it cannot be classified as art. Note that Zhou also adopted an us-them argument. He's not unappreciative of European art, but he understands that its technique is incompatible with what he calls brushwork and what we now call facture. Since the latter was required for personal assertion, and since personal expression was required for a painting to achieve the status of art, Zhou argues that European painting isn't art at all, and therefore can't be compared with Chinese art. Now, this latter argument is, of course, a defensive gesture. The best way to deal with your rival in the cultural sphere is to place him or her outside the category of rivalry altogether. Such an argument is of interest mainly because it reveals the author's anxiety and, ironically, his recognition of the other as a rival. What is more interesting in Zhou's argument is the role of brushwork. Expressive brushwork was not new to Chinese art criticism, of course, but what is new here is the identification of brushwork with Chineseness. In this passage, expressive brushwork becomes the identifying feature of a cultural tradition set in opposition to another. and which defines itself in contrast to that other. This may be the first time that the expressive mark was deployed in international cultural politics, but it would not be the last. Now, there is much more at stake here than petty rivalry over cultural superiority. I noted above that scales of value are correlative. Normally, the values at one end remain there, but once a nation or its intellectuals finds itself locked in a dynamic defined by cultural binaries, this dynamic can encourage rival nations either to converge or diverge along the poles of the scale. In the first case, national rivals may develop favored features of style more rapidly in an attempt to outdo or accommodate one another, as when Chinese artists working in the Qing court with European artists develop styles that increasingly privilege deep space, fine detail, and finish. But in cases of intense cultural rivalry, binaries can also encourage rapid or extreme divergence away from some perceived other, the opposite end of the scale. Such may have been the case during the 17th century and early 18th centuries, when radical experiments in pictorialization supplanted the previously dominant Suzhou school. While Suzhou school paintings are not particularly naturalistic, they aren't anti-naturalistic either. As mentioned earlier, displacing naturalistic standards had been a cause célèbre during the 11th and 12th centuries, but by the 16th century it was no longer a big issue. Not so in the paintings of Badacharan or Chertau, which you see on the right, and other outstanding masters of that period. Now, to attribute this radical shift to European influence is hard to imagine, seeing as the standard of value is the exact opposite of that found in European scales of the time. But it doesn't follow that European art was not part of the historical dynamic within which such styles evolved. The European presence revived naturalism as a challenge that called for a strong assertion of Chineseness. Precisely this kind of dynamic is evident in both Wu Li's and Zhou Yigui's remarks, where Chinese painting is defined as expressive brushwork in contrast to the laborious and conventional practices required for European-style naturalism. The presence of such a challenge may have encouraged the thematization of brushwork at the expense of even minimal naturalistic conventions, thereby jump-starting rapid development toward a more insistent and self-conscious abstraction. Now I'm going to read one more Chinese critic on European art. In the late 19th century, Zheng Ji wrote his Introduction to the Art of Painting not long before Cézanne took to trashing academic standards. In that book, he provided yet another defense for Chinese painting, but this defense was likely aimed at compatriots who were beginning to denigrate self-expressive styles in favor of post-Renaissance styles, which were trendy at the time. For trendy Chinese intellectuals of this period, naturalism came more and more to be understood as the visual correlate of science, those practices that had enabled the English to defeat China in the Opium Wars. As Zheng Ji saw it, however, the heart of the issue still remained brushwork. Some say that foreign painting is better than scholar painting. By the way, the term for foreign painting here is yi, which is supposed to have been illegal by that time. But anyway, most likely it's just such people haven't learned the marvels of brushwork. In painting, how could one ignore brush and ink? Yet in foreign painting, the brushstrokes don't appear as strokes, and the ink can't be seen as ink. It is only concerned with capturing the painting. The image resembles those in life, and that's all there is. Notice that Zheng also begins with an us-them binary, pointing out that European painting suppresses the facture or the status of pigment as pigment. But by this time, the contrast as stated no longer obtained. Zheng Ji was unaware that brushwork, or facture, figured significantly in the painting of Manet, Cézanne, Van Gogh, and other European masters of the period. No doubt he was also unaware that in the generation following his death, Europeans and Chinese would reverse their positions in the naturalism versus expression debate. Now, on the European side, Roger Fry may have been the most important figure in bringing about the reversal. Fry had grown up in a cultural environment highly receptive to the artistic sensibilities of East Asia, especially Japan. The cultural politics of Fry's theories, however, differed from Ricci's, Wu Li's, or just about anyone else prior to that time. Previous writers quite naturally defended a local scale of value, which is to say a local economy of art production, along with its embedded visualities. And both European and Chinese artists framed their pictorial practice in relation to an international situation defined by cultural politics. Fry's theories by no means transcended that politics, but Fry and the artists he admired embraced openly the international character of the enterprise. As early as 1910, Fry asserted that the future of art in Europe would be determined by its relationship to Asian artistic practice. When once the cultivated public has grown accustomed to the restraint, the economy of means, the exquisite perfection of quality of the masterpieces of Eastern art, it will, one may hope, refuse to have anything more to say to the vast mass of modern Western painting. Note that Fry identified Western painting with the cumbrous machinery of merely curious representation, which is to say post-Renaissance naturalism. It was Asian art, on the other hand, that would guide modern artists in their pursuit of the essential elements of things. Now, in 1910, the essential elements of things encapsulated what Fry meant by abstraction, that is to say, to extract the essence out of the object. But despite Fry's admiration for Asian art, there's nothing Asian about this line of argument. Traditional European art had derived its authority from the claim that it represented truth, where the guarantor of truthfulness was a convincing degree of fidelity to the object, even if nature had to be improved in the process. The argument adopted here is a variant of that. Essence, of course, is a core concept in European philosophy from classical times onward, but nothing like it figures in the criticism of art in China that I know of. China and other Asian nations had another role to play in Fry's argument. Now, at this stage, I should reveal that Fry's remarks, which could be construed as an early manifesto of modernism, were published in a book review entitled Oriental Art. The book reviewed was Lawrence Binyon's Painting in the Far East, published in 1908. In that book, Binyon endorsed a variety of art critical categories common in the writings of Chinese critics. Among these was the dichotomy between expression and naturalism, which you find in Zhang Yangyuan already in the 9th century, as well as the ideal of calligraphic brushstroke. Here I'm quoting Binyon. In the art of the tongue was a conscious effort to unite calligraphy with painting. By this we must understand that painters strove for expression through brushwork, which had at once the life-communicating power of the lines that suggest the living forms of reality and the rhythmical beauty inherent in the modulated sweep of a masterly writer. For to write the Chinese characters beautifully is to have command of the brush such as any painter might envy. Now, since the late 19th century, the term rhythm had become part of the vocabulary of critical writing through the influence of Rogel. Rogel, however, uses the term rhythm to refer to repetitious elements in a composition. As late as 1905, Fry was still using the term in that sense, in Regel's sense. About the same time, however, Herbert Giles had adopted rhythm as a translation for the Chinese term qiyun. Chinese critics employed this term to refer to body movements relevant to personal character in art. This use of rhythm imbued the English term more specifically with the emotive power of the human gesture. In 1904, Binyon had employed this translation in Burlington magazine, and by 1910, Fry appears to have given the term a Binyonesque inflection. So 1905, he's using it in Regel's sense. By 1910, he tells us this. No one could look even at the reproduction given in Mr. Binyon's book of a painting of a dancing girl without feeling the greatness and originality of Matabe, without recognizing the spontaneity and force of the imaginative pulse which here realizes so intensely the vital unity of rhythmic movement and presents it in forms so austerely and nobly restrained. Rhythmic movement here refers to the rhythm in Binyon's book, which is to say qiyun, a term implying spontaneous, evocative bodily motion. Now, the language of self-expression has entered so deeply into the rhetoric of modern art, it's difficult for us now to appreciate how novel was the conflation of brush movement and personal emotion in 1910. Its novelty is apparent, however, in the pains Binyon took to explain the idea to his readers in 1911. In his Flight of the Dragon, Binyon bemoaned the persistent hegemony of Greco-Roman ideals and the absence of any general theory capable of investing the new art with meaning. The most viable alternative, he felt, was Xiehe's 6th century rhythmic vitality, or spiritual rhythm, qiyun, expressed in the movement of life. Binyon identified this concept with the expressive power of brushstrokes capable of conveying the personal thoughts and emotions of the artists. The secret of art, he says, a 12th century critic, this is Binyon speaking here, The secret of art, says a 12th century critic, lies in the artist himself. And he quotes the conviction of an earlier writer that just as a man's language is an unerring index of his nature, so the actual strokes of his brush in writing or painting betray him and announce either the freedom and nobility of his soul or its meanness and limitation. Personality, in the Chinese view, counts enormously. The earlier critic to whom Binyon alludes is Guo Ruoxu, a late 11th century critic who first articulated the theory that a man's signature is a reflection of his personality. It's always the case, and this is Guo Ruoxu, that a painting must entirely convey the artist's character, the qi there, if it is to be hailed as a treasure in its age. This is contingent upon natural genius and proceeds from the depths of the artist's soul. It may be compared to the commonly practiced art of judging signatures. We call these heart prints, for it is first of all in the springs of the heart that one imaginatively creates forms and lines. When such lines are in harmony with the heart, they are called as prints. For example, with painting and calligraphy. It begins with thoughts and emotions, which then are impressed upon paper and silk. How should such works not be considered prints? If signature reveals a man's dignity and condition, how should painting and calligraphy not likewise reveal the quality of his personality? In this respect, painting is just like calligraphy. Now, about the same time, the literati critic Mi Fu described Su Shi's painting in these terms. He says, when Su Shi painted withered trees, the trunks and branches were bent and twisted without ends, and his rock texture strokes were hard and weird without ends, just like the pent-up feelings in his heart. Now, what expresses the pent-up feelings here is not the rocks and trees, but obviously the texture strokes. So we could see that theory already being applied elsewhere apart from Guo at that time. Now, in these few lines, Guo Ruoxu articulated a theory in which the line produced the artist movement simultaneously records and expresses the artist's character. Variants of this theory informed Wu's, Zhou's, and Zheng's cultural politics. But this is not to say they all meant the same thing. Like many pregnant ideas in history, this one was highly fungible and adaptable, and it changes over time. Certainly, by the time you get to Wu Li or Shi Tao, artists would go to extreme lengths to encode personal idiosyncrasies into their brushwork. Yet all of these artists, from Guo down to Shi Tao, relied on the conflation of stroke and personal character. So fungible was this idea that Binyon and other modernists would find it useful as well. It appears that by the second decade of the 20th century, modernist theories were already characterized by discursive hybridity. But one should not imagine that the cultural politics begun in the 16th century had disappeared. Perhaps because of the prominence that Binyon and Frye gave to Asian art in their theories, Asia would begin to assume a more prominent role in cultural politics. And indeed, 2 years after Frye published his review, Aby Warburg, in a lecture at the 10th Art Historical Conference in Rome, declared the core achievement of the Renaissance to have been the eradication of Oriental elements from Western art. Our sense of wonder at the inexplicable fact of supreme artistic achievement can only be enhanced by the awareness that genius is both a gift of grace and a conscious dialectical energy. The grandeur of the new art is given to us by the genius of Italy, had its roots in a shared determination to strip the humanist heritage of Greece of all its accretions of traditional practice, whether medieval, Oriental, or Latin. Now, genius here presumably refers to national genius. Granted, Warburg was referring specifically to the Middle East, but it seems unlikely he would have regarded those other arts that Frye admired any differently. In his extensive analysis of this lecture, E.H. Gombrich concluded that Warburg, in fact, identified the Orient with the dark forces of the mind, and so he relegated the Orient to traditional or pre-modern status, even while reaffirming the supreme artistic achievement of that very tradition that Frye's modernism had sought to replace with Asian values only 2 years earlier. The culture wars initiated in the 16th century were as vigorous as ever, but now the structural tension between naturalist and expressive theories of art was being projected onto a nationalist frame. Now, in China also, the naturalism expression dialectic assumed a nationalist guise, but in this case, Chinese intellectuals adopted the arguments and tropes of Europeans and Americans. Liang Qichao described China's national character as despotic, chaotic, slavish, and so on, while the West was construed as rational, scientific, and individualistic. Lu Xun adopted many of the same epithets in his descriptions of Chinese national character. Chen Duxiu wrote that the realistic spirit of Western art could be a cure for the repetition and loss of originality that he claimed had characterized the art of the Qing dynasty. And I bring Manet's portrait of Émile Zola here so you can see just how original that Xu Beihong is. Now, scholars have not failed to notice the resemblance between these epithets and American missionary accounts of China's national character. It's only in recent years that scholarship in China has recognized that in this rhetoric, the active hegemony of a European mode of nationalist discourse. The racialist and essentialist foundation of this discourse was a product of the late 18th and 19th century European thought. By accepting the apologetic writings of the missionaries, itself a product of cultural politics, Chinese intellectuals essentially surrendered the arguments of Wu, Zhou, and Zheng to European critics. Meanwhile, as Fry's theories waxed influential in the West, the opposite camps continued a stout defense of Western naturalism. Only a few years after Warburg's address, the primacy of mimesis was reasserted in a catalog prepared for the Burlington Fine Arts Club. A single line may mean nothing beyond a line. Add another alongside and both disappear, and we are aware only of the contents, that is to say the object, and a form is expressed. The beauty of a line is in its result, in the form it helps to bring into being. This is a reassertion of naturalist ideals. But Fry responded to that, saying, the beauty of a line is in its result, in the form which it helps bring into being. Here the author has undoubtedly pointed out the most essential quality of good drawing, but I should dispute, rather by way of excessive caution, his first statement. A single line may mean nothing beyond a line. Since a line is always at its least the record of a gesture, indicating a good deal about its maker's personality, his tastes, and even probably the period when he lived. Of course, that last line is a rather good summary of Guo Ruoxu's theory as summarized by Binyon. But it was precisely this view that troubled the Burlington author. The difference between the Burlington author and Fry exposed a deep chasm separating post-Renaissance Western art from what we now call modern Western art. Is an image, even an abstracted image, requisite for expression, or can pure form itself convey emotion? Is it the purpose of line to define an expressive image, or is its function to transmit the artist's psychic state through gesture? This exchange makes apparent the fact that the view formerly espoused by Guo, Wu, Zhou, and Zheng, and here championed by Fry, remained foreign to many Europeans as late as 1918. However, Fry came down squarely on the side of expression in his essay on line as a means of expression. The quality of line, which, while having an intelligible rhythm, and here it means qiyun, does not become mechanical, is called its sensitiveness. And here the most obvious thing is clearly that the line is capable of infinite variation, adapting itself to form at every point of its course. It clearly demonstrates Matisse's intense sensibility, and it is for this reason that I called it provisionally calligraphic. Now this is, as far as I know, is the first time calligraphic is applied to modern art, and Fry felt that he had to provide an extensive gloss on it, explaining that calligraphy can be expressive as in China or Persia. I'm going to move ahead a little faster now. And so he argues that Matisse is, in essence, Matisse's new and subtle rhythm, so curiously contradictory of the assertive rhythms of academic art, is in turn becoming a kind of standard of calligraphy for the modern artist. This idea, again, was picked up by D.S. McCall, who, again, basically summarized Guo Ruoxu's theory, referring to a drawing as a rhythmical gesture. And Roger Fry, when he republished his 1909 essay on aesthetics in 1920, basically wrapped up the idea in these terms. The first and most important of the expressive elements in art was the rhythm of the line with which the forms are delineated. The drawn line is a record of a gesture, and that gesture is modified by the artist's feeling, which is thus communicated to us directly. Now that sounds a lot like Guorou, but the ultimate irony, in fact, by this time in the 1930s, Fry is even calling artists like or Botticelli Chinese artists. It was just out of control, this hybridity. However, just about that time, Mr. Fry goes to China. And his theories are adopted by Feng Zikai, who published an article called The Triumph of Chinese Painting in Modern Art, in which he argues that modern art basically adopts Chinese values, which of course is ultimately adopting the same nationalist argument that say Warburg had adopted. It's not much different. And in his argument, ironically, he basically uses Fry's theories rather than any theories that we could directly associate with China. This paragraph is basically a summary of Fry. You can pretty much say that prior to the post-impressionists, there's no line in Western art. In impressionist painting, all you have are dabs of paint. You don't see any lines. Before that, with the realists, such as Millet's charcoal drawings, although lines may be distinct, for the most part, they function as the boundary of a form. Those lines that can have some expressive effect are extremely few. The great mural paintings of the Renaissance also show not a hint of true understanding of line. But when you get to the post-impressionists, as explained above, then Cézanne, Van Gogh, Gauguin, and others stress the expression of the soul's movement and power and chose line as the sole medium for expressing the soul's rhythm. Now, the Chinese word he uses for rhythm here is not qiyun, but rather lu dong, a literal rendering of Binyon and Fry's rhythmic movement. This new term clearly aligns itself with Fry's rhythm and inflates hybridity to another power. Now, by the 1940s, Fry's role as chief priest of modernism had been assumed by his admirer, Clement Greenberg, while Binyon's role as leading Asianist had been taken up by George Rowley. This new order emerges clearly in Greenberg's 1950 review of Rowley's Chinese painting, for it recapitulates many of Fry's themes. And when it comes to the use of the brush, that use which conveys exact feeling with every touch and harmonizes each touch as an individual facet of feeling with the unifying emotion of the whole picture, then the Chinese masters certainly have no equals. Of course, this too sounds like Guorou, but at that moment, a new wave of interest in Asian art was sweeping across the United States. This time, the object of admiration was not the delicate brushwork of Song academicians, but the brutal ink attacks of the so-called Zen masters. However, as Bert Winter Tamaki's scholarship shows, the easily recognized origins of this more obviously calligraphic stroke only seem to have intensified competition over its ownership. In fact, despite his review of Rowley's book in the tradition of Roger Fry, Greenberg declared, as if in desperation, that not one of the original abstract expressionists has felt more than a cursory interest in Oriental art. The sources of their art lie entirely in the West. Now, we must bear in mind that this was the moment when abstract expressionists were redefining the meaning of modernism in American terms, and it was precisely at that moment that cultural politics once again fostered a regime of cultural purification. Now, clearly, credit for the expressive mark was vital for 1950s American critics as it had been for Feng Zikai in the 30s, or Zheng Ji in the 19th century, or Wu Li in the 17th. And one could follow the story forward through Johns, Rauschenberg, Liechtenstein, and up to the present. The question is, what do we learn from this longue durée survey of the valorized brushstroke? Recall that historians and social scientists sometimes portray sets of values, such as self-expression, as characteristic of national groups. The material reviewed today suggests that cultural values can be more fungible than national myth would imply. Such values and their attendant rhetorics are better conceived as resources that can be exchanged and adapted when local circumstances favor it. Cultural politics encourages a binarized us-them dynamic, which ironically is necessarily interactive. Some modernist styles appear to have evolved within just such an international dynamic. Third, cultural competition along two poles of a common scale of value can encourage rapid or radical development of forms, institutions, or ideas. So I'm going to skip a couple things. Beautiful stuff. Having returned to the problem of culture and genius, it will be fitting to conclude the essay by allowing E.H. Gombrich the last word. Alas, in the 70 years that have passed since Warburg's death, our pride in being Europeans has been dealt a devastating blow. At the same time, we have also had to learn utterly to distrust national, racial, or cultural stereotypes. You cannot tar whole civilizations with the same brush. Thank you.